a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Cultures.
Okay, we're going to start with TEFL Culture, and this week's TEFL Culture is Community Language Learning. Do either of you know much about community language learning?
I know a little about it. I've read the chapter in Richards and Rogers, but beyond that, not really a lot, no.
Yeah, okay. Basically, a bit of background, first of all. It was created by Charles Curran, who was an American Jesuit priest, actually, and worked in counseling learning, which was a more general approach to education, but he applied it to language learning, which is when it became community language learning.
Yeah.
The basic idea is that what happens, let's see, there's two phases. So there's investment and reflection.
Okay.
Curran uses a lot of maybe slightly odd terms or terms that we don't usually hear in EFL circles to describe things. He was a Jesuit priest, so he also used a lot of religious analogies.
Right.
Always claimed that they weren't very religious, that he was just using them as analogies, but a lot of his critics maybe called him out on trying to apply his religious beliefs to it.
Right.
Anyway, the two phases, investment and reflection. The investment phase is basically what it sounds like, students investing themselves in the language. And
in what sense investing themselves?
It's considered, it comes under the term of humanistic language teaching.
Right.
And so it was a move away from, one of the early moves away from perhaps this idea of looking at sentences not related to the students' own lives,
right?
The learners' own lives. Maybe the thing that most people know about community language learning is this idea of, and this is only just one example of student investment, but the learners sit in a circle. The teacher, or I think that they give different names, the knower, the teacher is sometimes known as the knower or the resource person, is outside the circle. And the learners start a discussion amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
If they can say what they want to say in English, they do. If they can't, they signal to the knower, who then comes close to them. The learner whispers to the knower in their L1 what they want to say, and then the teacher whispers back to them how to express that idea in English.
Right.
So this approach depends on L1 knowledge?
It depends on the teacher having very, very good L1 knowledge.
Okay. Right. Interesting.
And then the typical way that it happens then is the learner would then say what they want to say, express what they want to say, but they record themselves doing it. So when they know what they want to say and how they want to say it, they would turn on the recorder, record themselves, and then stop it.
Right.
And then whoever wants to speak next raises their hand. Again, they try to express it. If they can't, they get help from the teacher, and they record themselves.
Okay, interesting.
Yep.
Was the use of the term knower one of his religious analogies? The teacher is like the knower putting the students on the ark of language?
Not that kind of Noah.
Oh, okay.
The knower, yeah. Some of the, yes, even more than that, sometimes he did describe the knower, the teacher, in kind of godlike terms. Yeah. And
that's how I see myself.
right. And one of the ideas was basically that, if you know 2 words of German and somebody is fluent in German, in terms of their German use, they are godlike to you, was the idea.
Like experts, kind of that idea of the teacher as expert and non-expert.
Yeah,
Thing.
also.
Yeah. How does this, so you've got a course, for example, and you use this approach for a course, but if the students all need different things at different times, how does that become a cohesive lesson? If they're just like as you say, if they're just whispering to the teacher every time, how do they all learn something out of it?
I mean, I suppose the idea is it's connected to maybe interactionist cognitive theories that they learn through this interaction.
Okay, right.
Another aspect of Curran's ideas was these kind of 5 stages of development that learners go through.
Yeah.
And he kind of equates them to maybe stages of an infant becoming an adult.
Right.
Okay.
What were the 5 stages?
The 5 stages are, let me see if I can find them. The birth stage, and the birth stage is important. So another important part of this method is recognizing that learners have a lot of anxieties and negative feelings in their language learning, either about the target language or about what's the activity in the classroom, all these things. And so it's very much about trying to dispel those negative feelings.
Okay.
That's part of the birth stage. Next is, so as they approve, they start to gain a little bit of independence from the parent or the knower or God, however you want to call them. The next stage is they still need help, but they're starting to be able to express things on their own. Maybe at the birth stage would be, complete beginners who everything they want to express, they need to know, they need to find out how to say it from the teacher.
Right.
So the next stage, they start to get a bit of independence. The third stage is they can speak independently, more or less, not with perfect accuracy, but basically they don't need the knower too much to help them.
Right.
The next stage, so before I go into the next stage, another important aspect of this is first there's the investment, but there's also the reflection. So after the group has finished their discussion, after the knower decides that they've kind of expressed enough, they stop and then they listen back to the recording, which should sound like just one continuous discussion.
Okay.
Because they've only recorded the bits that the
I
relevant
see.
parts.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So from that, the students can get a feeling of satisfaction, I guess. Yeah.
That's part of it.
And at that stage, I guess they're focusing on the the new forms that they've learnt from the teacher.
It's
very kind of, these are the forms we're going to focus on based on the recordings, that kind of thing.
So the reflection takes different, there's different phases of the reflection, but part of it is maybe step-by-step analysing of forms that have come up.
Right, okay.
While they were doing it, they're not really that aware of the forms, but when they have it recording, and I think the teacher maybe also transcribes it line by line, and then can look at how it's gone.
Yeah.
The reflection also, though, is kind of a more humanistic reflection. The students talk about how they felt while they were doing it, and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Right.
I realized, researching about this, that actually I've done this reflection stage with students. I think I mentioned a few podcasts ago that I used a method kind of loosely based on the silent way. But part of that was at the end of the day, the last maybe 30, 45 minutes was we went over all the students. We'd record kind of interesting sentences that the students produced, and we'd spend the rest of the time going over the sentences and also just talking about how the students felt about that day's work.
Right.
It's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be very positive. So in my own language learning experience, I've had situations where I've been really trying to express what I wanted to say, and then the teacher's just kind of gone, I don't understand, sorry, and then moved on to another student.
Right.
And then, after that you just feel a bit depressed and you don't want to do any more speaking. So I can see how going over it and kind of talking about it would aid your confidence and therefore influence your learning.
Yeah, I think that reflection stage is really nice. It's a nice idea. I think a lot of people do things like, self-checks or self-assessment, but that's just purely about like how they did, how they achieved certain aims during the lesson, but just talking in general how they felt about how it went, and maybe reviewing specific forms might be interesting.
So this is called community language learning? In what sense is this community?
So it's just talking about the community of the classroom.
The community of the
and
classroom.
You're creating a classroom community. Yeah, it's not talking about a wider community.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, the fourth stage, so the third stage was the learners can speak independently. The fourth stage is that they are secure enough to take criticism and being corrected. So that the teacher doesn't do too much of that.
Yeah.
Part of being a community language learning knower is explaining things in it. I think that they describe it as doing it in a very flat way, so without putting any, when you are correcting or when you're recasting something, doing it without any kind of judgment in your voice or those kind of things.
Right.
Maybe more of a New Testament God than an Old Testament God. Yeah. And then the final stage is the child that was born in the first stage becomes an adult and then can become a knower.
Is this over the stage of like one lesson, or
No.
in
This is the entire language learning career. Of that learner.
Right?
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So probably many. I imagine most learners don't reach the fifth stage.
Right. Yes.
But I'm not sure.
That's the case for most learners following any method.
Yeah, exactly.
Most of them don't gain a particularly high level of proficiency. I find.
I guess like in terms of one lesson, though, they could reach the fifth stage in terms of that one lesson, for example. You know, they go from not knowing what to say to the last stage of being able to say it really well.
Right.
They're able to say those rules to the other students in the class. So
Yeah.
maybe that could be reached.
So they reach a level of proficiency with the target language, you mean?
Yeah, just with a particular sentence or a form in the class, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's kind of a dogma lesson. You go in with no particular target language,
So it's
and
emergent.
everything comes from the students. It's just what they want to talk about.
Right.
But I think you're right. Maybe just on a micro level, you can kind of go through that cycle.
Right.
Do you think this would be effective in, for example, in every kind of class? So, for example, exam preparation classes. Do you think this would be an effective approach, or do you think that in certain contexts you actually need to select target language and that kind of thing?
I suppose it'd depend on the kind of exam.
Well.
I mean, if it's a speaking exam or a grammar, maybe a certain level of a certain type of grammar exam. If the knower is kind of skilled enough at pulling out certain forms, possibly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, any final questions? Would you this method of recording discussions and using that as the basis for looking at language?
I like that idea. Because it's kind of related to the idea of the language laboratory. You know, where students are recording their speech and instantly reflecting on it. And I like that idea. It seems a bit impractical. It seems difficult to achieve in certain contexts. But I like that idea of instant reflection and actual using the actual language of students.
I tend to agree. I think it's and I said I don't know if I would be able to use it myself or if I'd get very frustrated with the impracticality.
You mean as a learner?
As both a learner and a teacher. But I can see that some of the concepts that influence the approach are very useful. So as we said, the reflection period and so on. I think that those could be very positive in the language classroom. So I think some elements of it would be very useful.
Just one more thing. I'd also be a little bit concerned about the L1 use as the teacher. Obviously, that's something that would hamper me perhaps in using this approach.
Yeah, I guess the L1 use would drop off as you move through the 5 stages.
Yeah, that's the idea.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, that was this week's TEFL culture.
TEFL Pioneers.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Pioneer, I'm going to be talking about the Thomasites. So this isn't just one person. This is the first time we've had a group of people as a TEFL Pioneer. But we're going to be talking about the Thomasites. Have either of you heard of the Thomasites before?
Nope.
No. Okay, cool. So the Thomasites were the first group of English teachers who went to the Philippines. Maybe before I tell you about them, I'll give you a bit of background to the story. So the Philippines were a Spanish colony from 1565 to 1898. And in 1898, the Philippines was sold to America for $20 million. That's US dollars. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1898 that might have been quite a lot, and this led to the Philippine-American War, in which the First Philippine Republic was defeated, and then the islands were split into smaller territories and ruled over by the US government. So we've already talked about the history or the TESOL industry in the Philippines today, but this is how perhaps this is the start of the story. So under US administration, President William McKinley, who I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, he's one of the lesser presidents, or lesser known presidents.
Right. Yeah. Well, he called for the promotion of education in the Philippines, and in particular, he wanted to establish a public school system, an English medium public school system. So they recruited some teachers from the US to send over to help establish this school system. And it seemed like quite a dangerous job for people to do. So there were rumours of headhunters in the Philippines, tropical diseases and so on. But the teachers were enticed by... So a few things. First, the salary was quite high. It was $125 a month, which was, again, it doesn't sound like a lot, but at the time, it was a lot. There was the chance for employment. There was a desire to help, an altruistic desire. And also, many of them had boyfriends or fiancés stationed in the Philippines. So these were often female teachers who wanted to go and be with their loved ones. And the final reason was just adventure.
Sure.
Yeah. And so even though it seemed like quite a dangerous job, over 8,000 people applied to teach, and 540 teachers were selected. So more came over later. They arrived in 1901 on a boat called the USS Thomas, and that's where they got their name, the Thomasites.
Right.
Yeah. And they took over English teaching duties from a group of soldiers who were teaching English at the time, probably without any ESL certifications. But, yeah. And then they were sent around the country. Some of them stayed in Manila, and they taught not just English, but they taught lots of subjects. But I think that the fact that they were teaching in English makes them TEFL pioneers. They also conducted English language teacher training for Philippine teachers. And these were all proper certified teachers who'd graduated from US teaching colleges. Yeah.
Where were they teaching? In like state schools?
Yeah, so as I said, they were establishing a public school system. So they were they were going around and setting up schools, and then training teachers to work in the schools.
Oh, I see.
In English. In fact, when they started, they didn't have any proper facilities. So there were no blackboards, no teaching materials. In fact, they didn't really have any classrooms. And they often clashed with the students over the language barrier, so they didn't speak the students' language, the students didn't speak their language, often the students were absent or late, so they had a lot of problems facing them. And often, I think this is something that's still a problem today, the teaching methods they were trying to import were at odds with the methods the Spanish had been using in their education system, which was mainly rote memorization. And that's still a problem, I think, that people talk about, trying to import, certain Western models of education into classrooms where they have maybe a different approach to education. Perhaps maybe the biggest and most worrying issue that they faced was health issues. So in the first 2 years, 27 of the teachers died.
Wow.
Either from disease or from murder.
Okay, that's a pretty high percentage, actually.
It is. Out of 540, 27 died in 2 years.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad. But they accomplished quite a lot. So they founded schools and universities, including Philippine Normal University, which is it's not a very inspiring name for a university, but there you go.
They still use those kind of names today, though, I think. I think when I went to Thailand, there was a university that had the word normal in the title.
Yeah, I wonder what the etymology of that is.
I think it just means like a standard polytechnic
Right.
university. I don't know really, to be honest, but yeah.
Yeah. But they turned the Philippines into the third largest English-speaking nation in the world, which is quite an achievement, I think.
Yeah.
Whether or not you agree is good or bad, I think it's quite an achievement. And also, one thing that they did, which I think is a positive thing, is they introduced the country to the idea of education for everybody. So not just for the elites, which it had been before, but it was a public school system they were trying to implement, and it was for everybody. And maybe a good example of this is there was one famous teacher who came over a little later in 1907, and she was called Mother Delight Rice. And she was a teacher of the deaf. And so she went over to try and include deaf children or hearing impaired children in the education system. And when she couldn't find any deaf children or enough deaf children to suit her needs in the cities, she went out into the countryside and hunted for I say hunted.
For deaf children.
Headhunted.
Yeah.
She was one of the headhunters that was scared of, right?
Yeah, it does make you wonder how far she would have gone in her quest for deaf children, deafening them herself, perhaps. So they did have some positive effects, some maybe questionably positive effects. So turning the Philippines into a largely English-speaking nation, you could read it either way. But I think that the criticism that they've attracted in recent years is also very interesting. So, for example, although they did a lot of good, they were the product of an American colonial education policy. And they introduced English medium education, which people have argued did a lot to kind of stifle the indigenous cultural and linguistic growth of the Philippines. Another point was that when they were recruited, they were instructed to kind of act as amateur anthropologists, to keep diaries about the people that they were teaching and working with. And reading their diaries, they had quite a lot of negative or quite racist things to say. So they described Philippine men as effeminate, and they described the students as childlike and deficient, and so on. And it was through some of these perceptions that the Orientalist colonial policy was continued, because people kind of thought these people need to be governed, they need to be looked after, and so I think perhaps those criticisms are as interesting, at least, as the good that they did. So what do you think about the Thomasites?
Do we know much about the methods they used?
Not much. We know that they were trying to encourage critical thinking, apparently, which is something that we still try and do a lot today. But, I mean, whatever method of education was prominent in the US at the time, that's what they were trying to import.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly what that would have looked like, but yeah.
I mean, it seems like they were successful, at least, in whatever they're trying. I wonder if kind of conversion in terms of such a large number of people speaking a new language has happened before. It seems kind of unprecedented.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I think that maybe because there were so many of them, maybe because it was part of a colonial policy, maybe because there was such strong government backing, it allowed them to be that successful. But considering the challenges that they faced, and considering the dangers that they would have heard about in advance of going over there, I think that they must have been a fairly extraordinary group of people.
Yeah.
Do you think there was any ramifications on the language that they speak today? Because obviously you have a large number of English speakers coming into the country, and then a large number of local students learning the language. How do you think that might have impacted on kind of like a I can't even say the word, creolization of the language today?
Well,
Tagalog, isn't it?
Yeah, well, as we've discussed in previous episodes, in the Philippines, people from the Philippines tend to speak with quite a strong American accent. They tend to produce a very standard American form of English. So I think possibly what they may have done by being part of this colonial education policy is they may have stopped the growth of Creoles by pushing one particular model of the language.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know too much about the situation of English and Creoles in the Philippines, but it's my understanding that generally it's a standard American model they tend to produce. So, yeah.
I guess if they were going there teaching one particular language, perhaps there wasn't any occasion where the two languages would become intertwined with each other, perhaps.
Yeah, I wonder how much they influenced each other. You would think there would be some influence.
Yeah. Well, there's still a lot of English words that you use in Tagalog, isn't it? It's lots of different languages together, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that it was more of a one-way absorption of words in that sense, because I don't think that, as it's a colonial education, I mean, you can see the same thing in, like, Okinawa. One language was much more dominant because there was a power structure pushing it onto people. And so that language wasn't really influenced by the local language, but the local language was influenced a lot more by the incoming language.
Yeah.
To what extent did the Thomasites learn the local language?
I don't think at all.
Or get involved with, did they marry into Society? Or?
I don't know. I doubt that they spent much time learning the local language because they were there to convert the country into an English-speaking country, essentially.
Yeah, at the time,
I suspect that there probably was intermarriage and that kind of thing, but considering what they wrote about the people, I think that possibly not as well.
Yeah. I imagine some.
Yeah.
With that, I mean, it's not a huge number of people, but it's enough that.
Yeah, I mean, more teachers came later on as they went, but then the fact that they were training local teachers meant that they withdrew, and the local teachers took over the teaching duties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's the story of the Thomasites. They turned the Philippines into a major population of English speakers, which it still is today, and they're probably one of the major driving reasons behind why the Philippines is such a central place, or becoming such a central place for English teaching as well, as we've discussed in previous episodes. So that's the Thomasites, and that's the TEFL pioneers for this week.
TEFL News.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL News section, I'd like to kind of introduce a study that's recently been carried out by, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly, Chenjing Yu and Zoltan Dornier. Does that sound right to you?
Zoltan Dornier sounds
Zoltan
right.
Dornier sounds right.
We assume it's right. We always say it that way. But
these two researchers are based at the University of Nottingham in the UK, and they recently carried out a large-scale cross-sectional study into language learning motivation in China. Just before we start, what do you think might be the motivations for learning the English language in China?
Business opportunities.
Yeah,
I'd have thought economics largely. There's probably kind of hobbyists as well, people who are interested in culture and so on. But I'd have guessed it's mainly economically driven.
Yeah. So that's what this study sort of set out to try and find out. Basically, what kind of factors affected motivation, or how did motivation differ between a number of different contexts? For example, geographical. Teaching context, for example, high school, university, major learners of English and non-major learners of English, and also they wanted to look at gender differences as well to see if they were factors towards differing motivation. This study is slightly different in the sense that they used 10,000 secondary school and university learners in China, which is, although in the context of China this isn't very big, in the context of motivational studies this represents a particularly large scale research
a big sample size.
Yeah, because generally they're done in the hundreds or in a particular city or a particular school, but this one was across the whole of China, from east to west,
right?
And they found 10,000 participants.
Did this include was it all mainland China?
Yes, right. I think so. I don't think they included Taiwan or Hong Kong in this. It was just the mainland China itself. But they made very clear that it was a study from the east and the west, all parts of China, essentially. So what they were setting out to do was to present a comprehensive picture of motivational trends in China towards language learning of English. Are you familiar with Zoltan Dornier's work? He's kind of done a lot of different things.
Well, I did my master's degree at Nottingham, so he could have been my psycholinguistics professor, but I didn't study that, so he wasn't.
Okay,
I did a lot of research into communication strategies, which he used to write a lot about.
He did, yeah.
And now he tends to write more about motivation.
Yeah, so L2 motivation, and for this study, he used his own model, the L2 motivational self-system, which set out to record 3 different kind of components of motivation, which were the L2 self, the ought to L2 self, and the L2 learning experience. Sorry, the ideal L2 self. That was the first component, and the L2 learning experience. I'll just briefly explain the 3 components. The ideal L2 self concerns a desirable self-image of the kind of L2 user one would ideally like to become in the future. So something that they'd aspire to. The ought to L2 self is an imported self-image that attributes one's beliefs one ought to possess to meet the expectations of others and to avoid possible negative outcomes.
Yes, yeah. I've often wondered. I mean, I imagine there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Seems like it, yeah.
I always find that the ideal L2 self is it's a bit difficult to talk about, because when people ask me what's your ideal L2 self, I don't know, just being good, usually.
Yeah.
I mean, also ideal, why not just say, fluent? That's
But I think like a good example would be, Scott Thornbury recently, on his blog about the defossilization diaries, I think he was trying to learn Spanish at an older age, and he said that his ideal L2 self was giving a presentation on language teaching in Spanish. So I think that's a good example of it, but I don't know if everyone's got one of those.
Maybe not.
And the last section was the L2 learning experience, which was the motives related to the immediate learning environment. So, for example, the impact of the teacher, the curriculum, the peer group, and the experience of success.
Right.
So the L2 learning experience. So these were the three components that he was trying to measure amongst his different areas. And what the two researchers did was they gave a 73 6-point Likert scale of questions. So there were 73 questions, all containing a Likert scale.
Yeah.
So that was their main method of collecting data.
It's amazing they got 10,000 people to answer 73 questions each.
Yeah, that's why this is something quite new in this field. It's a very large-scale study.
Yeah.
So I'll just briefly... So what I'll do now is I'll briefly just kind of paraphrase the essay, essentially, and just present some of the findings. Okay. So they looked at, obviously, gender differences, geographical differences, and teaching contexts. And just begin with gender. So first of all, they found that the ought to L2 self scale slips into the negative domain, and the level of parental expectations is the lowest of all scales.
Right.
So they found they kind of argued that this goes against the common stereotype that typical disposition of Chinese learners is less individualistic and more socially determined, if that makes sense. So they found that, they basically set out believing that this would be the case, but they found that this wasn't.
Right. It subverted their expectations.
Right. Yeah. So basically that means that the students in general were kind of determining their own ought to L2 selves.
I think that's what
they weren't absorbing it from the outside so much.
Yeah. They talked about this idea of reciprocal, kind of a reciprocal behaviour, in the sense that the parents were putting a lot of money and investment into the student studies, and in return the students were trying to kind of give back to the parents what they put in.
Right.
So they found that there was a degree of motivation related to parental expectations in this sense as well.
Yeah.
And they also found that female L2 learners scored significantly higher than their male counterparts.
Right.
In general.
So higher levels of motivation.
Higher levels of parental expectation motivation.
Okay.
Of the ought to L2 self.
Oh, that's interesting. Because we were saying that it was probably driven by economics. You'd think that maybe men would have more of a pressure for business and that kind of thing. But it's interesting if females had more pressure from their parents to achieve in that sense. Yeah. But
they also stressed that their findings are still quite non-significant. Although there are differences, there's not enough of a disparity to make these kind of conclusions.
Yeah.
But in general, they indicate that dedication for learning English kind of overrides any gender differences, essentially, and that's one of their conclusions.
Okay.
In terms of geographical regions, they kind of refer to China as being bipolar, in the sense that there is a distinct east and west disparity.
Yeah.
Obviously, the east is a lot more affluent. Obviously, a lot more industrialized.
Yeah.
And the motivational variation is rooted in, as they say, the motivational variation is rooted in the economic stratification of China. So, and we can kind of assume this was going to happen, essentially.
Yeah.
And they kind of attribute students in the East, in Beijing and Shanghai, they're kind of more open to global English and English as a lingua franca.
Right.
And obviously being more globalized in that part of China, obviously their motivations towards learning English were higher than in the Western areas of China, which is kind of what we assumed would happen, essentially.
And what was the third area?
And the third area was teaching context. Yeah. And they talked about the ideal L2 self.
Yeah.
And they said it was more advanced or specialised in one's education, and the stronger the ideal language image the student entertains. So they found that the student's education increasingly opens up their horizon onto the global world beyond China, bringing about an increasing appreciation of global English. So that's what they found. That was what they believed. Well, that was their outcome, essentially.
Right.
But they found that in terms of teaching context, well, they also wanted to look at non-major English learners and major English learners. And obviously, as you'd expect, they found that English major learners had higher motivation in terms of the ideal L2 self.
Right.
Essentially.
Yeah.
So, obviously with this study, they wanted to kind of encapsulate all areas of China. Okay. And they did reach some conclusions. Obviously, as I kind of said, that's what they kind of found there.
Yeah. So what were the major conclusions of the study?
Okay, so I'll just summarise. So learners across the board tended to have positive ideal self-images associated with English and equally positive attitudes towards L2 learning. And they reported high levels of intended effort, and they were ready to invest in the process.
Right.
And they argue that their findings present a picture that it's different from the widely held belief that Chinese learners are primarily instrumentally motivated.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. It's interesting that's kind of what we said at the start. So we were wrong. Yeah. But that is very interesting because I think people do have very strongly held images of particular groups of students.
Yeah.
But when you actually go and ask those people, I think that we'd often find that the views that we have or the views that we've cultivated are wrong or at least incomplete.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure they recognize the limitations of a kind of survey study. Where, how aware can students really be of their own motivation or their own ideal L2 selves, etc. Which is not to say it's pointless. I think it's still very interesting results. But
it's the trade-off, isn't it? Because they've got this huge number of people, so they've got very consistent results. But to get down to the level of detail that you're talking about, they'd have to do a qualitative study. But obviously, you can't do a qualitative study with 10,000 people unless you've got 10,000 researchers to help you.
So they say that they make a lot of assumptions, basically, that they just assumed that it was related to the globalized nature of the East and the West, that these kind of patterns occurred, which we could assume going into the study too. Finally, the ought to L2 self dimension was by and large exempt from any geographical variation, pointing to a fairly even or moderate influence.
Okay, so fairly even distribution.
Yeah, that's what they say. Yeah. So there's a lot of research to pour over in this study, but I think in terms of this being quite an important venture, I think in terms of using 10,000 students. With a cross-section of both gender, geographical and teaching context. This represents something quite new in this field, motivation.
Yeah, I think it sounds like quite a major study, and it challenges a lot of assumptions that maybe people, including researchers, have held. So I think it sounds very interesting, a good contribution to the field.
The one bit that they don't go into are the kind of the implications for this study. They kind of leave that part out. But what do you think the implications might be, just to end this section?
Yeah, well, I think that's another big issue in terms of motivation studies is the classroom implications of that. The classroom implications often seem to be the same things, which is make activities interesting. In terms of raising, maybe the more interesting implications of things like raising learners' awareness of what English can do for them.
Perhaps.
But on a lesson-to-lesson or activity-to-activity basis, that I don't know what effect that has.
I would think it would have less of a classroom influence and more of an influence on policy and curriculum design.
That's what I was thinking.
Because
they can kind of look at the distribution of motivation, see where it is lower in which particular areas, and kind of give more emphasis to that. I guess.
You can target groups of learners better. Maybe you can try and diversify what you're teaching in order to meet the interests or broadly expressed interests of the groups.
Is English a compulsory subject for secondary school students in China?
I think it was,
Okay.
It was,
Right, for the students in this study, you mean?
For the students in all of this study, it was,
Okay, right.
And they were either taking it as a major or non-major. So this actual research article can be found in Applied Linguistics, which is produced by Oxford University Press.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of TEFLology. If you'd like to contact us, please get in touch at teflology@gmail.com. We welcome any of your suggestions, any of your ideas, any of your comments, any feedback. Please leave a rating or a review on iTunes. We don't have any yet, so if you want to leave some, that would be most welcome. And that's the end of the podcast. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.